I want to spend some time talking about Risk of Rain 2 this week since I've jumped back into it lately. But off the bat I think it's an absolute gem of a game, a real standout in the roguelite genre that barely puts a single foot wrong in my opinion. I also want to stand up while I'm recording the voiceover this week, just to see if it sounds different. In my last video talking about 20 Minutes Till Dawn, I talked about skill ceiling and its effect on replayability. With those thoughts in mind, this felt like a fairly natural game to talk about next. I want to talk about the recent expansion Survivors of the Void 2, but I'll save that till later on in the video. I've never played the original Risk of Rain, but have played the sequel for almost 100 hours. It's quite a unique game, and there's a few different ways to play it, I'll touch on that later. But for now, suffice to say, some of them get much more wild than others. At its core, Risk of Rain 2 is a third-person shooter in which you survive waves of enemies whilst progressing through various maps by activating a teleporter and defeating a boss. But it does rather quickly diverge from that basic premise once you get some decent items and become a god of death. And the reason I mentioned skill ceilings at the beginning is because when compared to 20 Minutes Till Dawn, the skill ceiling is indeed much higher in Risk of Rain 2. And in addition to all of the other positives, that's part of why I've played so much of it. I don't expect that you'd ever usually compare the two games, by the way. They're only really tangentially related, but I talked about 20 Minutes Till Dawn in my last video, so I'm just using it to make my point here. Each character has the standard loadout of 5 skills, those being a passive, primary, secondary, utility and a special. The combination of those, as well as the equipment slot that you find items for in game, mean that you can spend a good amount of time mastering a single character's kit. What I tend to find is that, like most games in this genre, once I've managed to go full on sicko mode as the kids call it, I don't need the full loadout of skills anymore. However, with a liberal application of experience and ability, it's possible to scrape through very far in Risk of Rain 2 on a very wonky build, which isn't something you'd be able to say about a game with less opportunity for individual skill, where you'd likely expect to just reset if the random number generator wasn't spitting out the right result for you. One of the standout points of this game is just how much stuff there is, from the weird little side passages through the game like the Lunar Portal, the Gilded Coast, and now with the expansion also the Void Fields, to the massive quantity of items. There's a whole lot to learn. Personally, I've done all of that learning by playing, which means I know fuck all. But this is one of those games that you could spend a long time figuring out even if you were scouring the wiki every time you bumped into something new. To back up the sheer volume of stuff, the game is absolutely sopping wet with style and features a really interesting prog rock soundtrack ranging from floaty pings and pongs to chuggy guitars followed by screaming drawn out solos. At times the funk levels get dangerous and draw out a little jazz stank face. To go with the soundtrack, the bright effects and saturated colours on screen pull things together perfectly, with strange environments and enemies that I can only really describe as abstractly weird and alien. It's quite a trip. Speaking of a trip, head on down to just below the video and click the subscribe button. And then if you're really feeling it, I made a Discord server too. At the time of writing this, you could be one of the very first into the server, which would gain you absolutely nothing. Now back to the video. The actual visual fidelity isn't really anything special with lo-fi textures and crunchy edges, but, you know, it kinda just works. It feels like they could have made it look technically better, whatever that really means, but instead chose not to. And while that approach might be divisive, it works really well for me, so I like it. Alright, so I mentioned earlier there's a lot of stuff. Let's talk about it. There's 13 characters available and they're all quite different from one another. I'll try and show a good mix in the video so you can get the idea. The first few are relatively simple to unlock, and then others involve some weird and difficult challenges, like unlocking Rex, the robot plant hybrid, which involves carrying an unstable battery through the first 4 stages of the game that will explode and kill you if you fall below half health. All of these challenges can be completed on the easiest difficulty, so it's not like you'll ever feel fully locked out of anything that you want to pursue. As well as that, there's a massive heap of items to get wet and wild with. As far as I know, all of the items from the base set are just purely buffs, whereas some of the Void and Lunar items are a little more weird and have niche uses, often trading one effect for another. The general key to winning though is just attack speed and bleed. That will see you through the game just fine as long as you're playing one of the more simple characters, but there's much more fun ways to get things done. The synergy between will-o-wisps detonate on kill and the fuel cans ignite on kill will make worlds burn in a rather satisfying manner, for example. But of course you don't usually get to choose the items you want, so these synergies are mostly born out of chance, which is probably for the best. That's how you find the fun stuff. There are mechanics in place to give you some choice though. Item shops offer a choice of 3, and perhaps the most powerful mechanic in the game, the item printers, allow you to scrap an item at random of the same rarity to get one of whatever the item printer is offering. That's usually how you end up stacking 20 of the same item to make something really dumb happen. What I tend to find is that I won't stick to the game for a particularly long time. Maybe I'll have a few sessions over a week or so, and then repeat that process in another few weeks. I'm not completely sure why that is. I enjoy the game massively, but only for a little while at a time. It's not a huge negative or anything. The fact that I can do that over and over again to add up to a total of 100 hours should make that obvious. I actually really like to have games like that in my library. I know that I can come back to them time and time again whenever I need to. This might be another one of those games that says a lot more about itself with the video than I can with words, since it's quite hard to explain where exactly the fun comes from. If you explain it mechanically, it sounds like it would get boring much more quickly than it does in practice. Instead of going into that, I'm going to talk about the recent expansion a little bit, Survivors of the Void. Expansion packs tend to just be called DLC nowadays, but when I were a lad, DLC was downloading the Invisible Car for Midtown Madness or the Tiger for Black and White 2. Not everyone actually had decent access to the internet back then, so downloadable content was quite the novelty. Anything that I paid for was an expansion, and almost always came on a disc, like Command & Conquer 2 Yori's Revenge. I remember opening the package with that bright yellow cover in it when I was a kid. And that was my main exposure to expansion packs growing up. New units and maybe an extra campaign for an RTS, or an extension of the progression in an MMO like World of Warcraft, of course. For me, that's what Survivors of the Void feels like. There's a pile of new items and enemies, 2 new characters and an alternate game mode that's a bit more of a simplistic wave-based experience than the normal mode. It gives me a warm and fuzzy feeling to play a good and proper expansion pack in the age of DLC that's clearly just cut content being sold a few weeks after release. The new character has a really fun kit that's designed to have you switching between a normal and a corrupted form. Just like the rest of the roster, it's very unique and a lot of fun. I've missed the feeling of having a game that I love expanded meaningfully like this. I hate to keep bringing up Path of Exile in every video I make, but perhaps that's part of the reason why I've played it so much. They're out there releasing large content patches every few months, scratching a similar itch in the back of my mind. For some reason it makes sense to me that I would get warm fuzzies from the devs of Risk of Rain, because speaking with zero actual knowledge of the way the devs operate, it just feels like whoever came up with and created a game like this must be a chill group of people. As far as I can tell, the team at Hopoo Games has stayed tiny, with just a few employees even after making 3 games and finding pretty good success. If one of the 3 of you somehow ends up watching this, you guys keep being you, it's obviously working. So there you have it. Another rambly, meandering video from me. Was it good for you? Well, even if it was just okay and didn't quite get you over the finish line, at least it was a short distraction from the current world state. It's important to remember that the world being on fire is only a problem if you go outside, or if your house is on fire, though if it is, remaining indoors might still be your better option. Until next time, goodbye.